Hello everyone and welcome to today's Mondac webinar in association with Oak Legal, discussing the Nigerian Start-up Act and the opportunities for technology. My name is Dan Sampaio and I'm joined by a brilliant panel to take us through today's discussion. Kenetche Ezezika heads Oak Legal's mergers and acquisitions, private equity, financing and corporate and investments practice. She's recognised for her astuteness and practical approach in driving transactions to closing. She routinely leads notable mergers and acquisitions and capital market transactions. Kenetche has extensive experience advising clients on financing arrangements, corporate restructuring, joint ventures, and on a wide range of commercial transactions and governance and compliance matters. Kazim Sodangi is currently the head of compliance of Smile Identity LLC, which is a private sector onboarding, identity verification, user authentication, and digital KYC service for Africa. He has served as Chief Legal Officer of the National Information Technology Development Agency. Kazim is a versatile legal luminary with subject matter expertise in policy, intellectual property, ICT, investment management, and strategic alliance management. He's had a diverse career in policy development, policy implementation, and regulatory compliance. Now, before I hand over to the panel to begin today's webinar, a housekeeping item. You can submit questions to today's panel by typing them into the questions pane or the toolbar on the right-hand side of your page, and we do encourage you to send those questions in. The panel will endeavour to answer as many of them as possible during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentations, but please do reach out after the webinar if you need any additional information. It's now my pleasure to hand you over to Kenetche and Kazim to begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that slide. So my name is Kasim, as introduced ably by the host. The key thing I want to demonstrate with this slide and is to give some context into the startup bill. I'll quickly mention also that I am multi-hatting. I wear another hat, which is a director for API and a co-founder. API is a non-for-profit policy intelligence service for technology and innovation. In this role, or in that organization, or in API, the primary responsibility is supporting tech firms and innovation firms think about and sort of triangulate around what is required for compliance, for policy, and for government directives and so on. So what the slide shows, and it's critical that I talk about this slide a bit, is the sort of choppy waters that are really the background to the Startup Act in Nigeria. It is the policy, I wouldn't call it simply inconsistency, incoherence in some sense, and sometimes the policy, the stealth environment to which policy is issued, which then inadvertently affects how investments are made, how startups operate, how technology firms operate in Nigeria. If you follow closely, you see a timeline that sort of suggests, border closures. It affected the startups that are in payment space. The Okada ban, the bikes for transportation, and investments were made significantly into Max NG, and if one or two other more bike hailing businesses in Lagos by startups in Nigeria. The broadcasting code and its implication on intellectual property and content moderation, the NIPOS license with implication on logistics services for e-commerce, the crypto ban with implication for investments made in crypto. I mean, if you see the timeline, I can just go on and on. The implication of all these created one of the supervening circumstances where the startup bill became absolutely necessary. In certain markets, if you take Tunisia's startup bill or Italy or what is the draft in Kenya, you find out that they try to address different things. Overarchingly, the Nigerian Start-up Act seeks to overarchingly increase collaboration and policy coherence. What the guiding philosophy was, if we can't change much, we'll seek to preserve the investment environment so that startups, venture capitalists, founders, accelerators can continue to make these investments that are profitable to citizens. Now, the opening the bill, and as you begin to engage with the bill, one of the first things you will see is the National Council for a national council that sort of coordinates the entire activity around the implementation of the startup bill. The National Innovation Council was inserted in that bill for one purpose, to ensure that all policies, all new regulations, all considerations for the startup bill are being cleared. So it operates as a clearinghouse to ensure that all agencies with responsibilities or with laws that are incidental to investment in Nigeria truly and really and truly go to the council to clear the proposals for regulation or for national frameworks or guidelines that would affect incentives, that would affect taxation, that would affect compliance, or penalties for startups in Nigeria. Because like I said, the key identification was we realized that there was choppy policy environment affecting the status of businesses and investments in Nigeria. That's why that council was created. The council has the president as the chairman and the vice president as the alternate chairman. It has the Honorable Minister for Digital Economy and for Communications and Digital Economy as the alternate chairman. It also has the governor of the central bank, the Ministry of Finance, Budget and Planning, and other sort of sensitive and key portfolios in the country, and made them a part of this council so that conversations can be surfaced. The bill also does something that no other law in Nigeria does, is that in the council it allowed registered startups that have been labeled, and I'm sure Kenichi will speak to the labeling process, to send representatives of their peers to be members of the council. It was also important to have the voice, to have an equal voice in the deliberations, in the conversations around, startups in Nigeria. So what the bill really did was to ensure that all the voices are considered before laws or rules or regulations that either derogate or amend or substantially upend business practices that affect startups, technology-enabled startups in Nigeria, are addressed. Another critical sort of, if you like, it's innovative. Another critical vehicle or instrument in that bill is the consultative forum of startups. So what was done was to ensure that in the drafting of that bill, that a consultative forum was inserted so that all startups that are so labeled can sit down, have conversations about what government is going to do, how these will affect these startups, and then table resolutions, proposals, ideas to council through the National Secretariat. A National Secretariat has been created for the purpose of administering the bill, which is the Secretariat of the Council, which will be located in the National Information Technology Development Agency. That agency is saddled with the responsibility of promoting and regulating technology standards in Nigeria, digital technology standards in Nigeria, and has been at the forefront of supporting the development of startups in Nigeria. So the goal of the consultative forum, or the objective, is to ensure that the council would have access and have visibility on the first-hand opinions and challenges that affect startups in Nigeria. So there are two key things to note: that there is a council. The council has representation from the startup community, which is critical. The third thing is that there is a secretariat which is anchored within the Information Technology Development Agency, which is sort of the champion for promoting the rights and the activities of startups in Nigeria. And that vehicle will process and document all memos that that will go, to council. Generally speaking, like I said, at the core of the drafting of this, and I was a member of the drafting team, I chaired even the drafting committee of for the Nigerian Start-up Bill, and that's why I'm highlighting really the key instruments that that will drive, and the key instruments and the philosophy that sort of are key components of how the Start-up Bill was constructed, and to ensure that we protect ultimately the investment of investors, venture capitalists, private equity, accelerators, or anyone who is investing in startups in Nigeria. I'll be happy to answer any more questions eventually on other considerations, sensitivities, on how certain things will play out, administratively. But I'm sure that Kenichi will take the next part, which covers, some of the processes and then incentives that are in the bill. Thank you. Or in the act now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kazim, for that introduction and talking us through the rationale for the passing of the Nigerian Start-up Act. I mean, this whole presentation is about considering the act and the opportunities that it presents to the tech ecosystem in Nigeria today, right? And as Kazim has said, there was obviously a need, a deep need to put something together. Tech startups were being deeply affected by government policies, by the unfavorable conditions and all that. And I think that the meeting of the government with the relevant officials in the tech ecosystem, or the relevant people in the tech ecosystem, and the bringing about this bill was a significant step in the right direction, right? It's a significant step to moving us to being like the tech hub of Africa, and maybe one day perhaps the world. So thanks very much. Aaron, we can go on. So we've put together a few slides, right? So we're going to be, Kazim has already done an introduction of the act and the rationale. We'll just touch on one or two things. He has also mentioned the relevant regulatory authorities. We're also going to be looking at who exactly or what exactly constitutes a startup for this purpose, or for the purpose of this act, and for the purpose of the tech ecosystem, the incentives that are available to the startups, and then the other people, because we have other entities within the tech ecosystem, not only the startup companies themselves. You have the accelerators and the incubators, you have the people that are going to fund and all that. So what are these incentives that we've said that this act, or this act has brought about, right, has created for these people to tap into? And therein lies the opportunity, right? Because if you get it right, incentives, right, then you're incentivizing people, and if incentives are right, then I mean the ground really is ripe for us to develop our tech ecosystem in Nigeria today. Aaron. Okay, so just an introduction, really saying, I think an earlier study was done, and there was like, it was found that a lot of Nigerian tech startups have in the past, they had a high failure rate. Like Kazim mentioned in his introductory speech, he talked about Maxby, he talked about people that had invested a lot of money into these various tech startups, only for one reason or the other, for them to be strangled and go out of business, right? And so because of this, was really a need to put together something that will create that enabling environment and all that. And that's how the Nigerian Start-up Act came about. And the act really applies to companies that are registered in Nigeria and have, of course, been granted the state startup label, which we'll see how that happens here. And also organizations and establishments whose activities create support and incubation for the labeled startup. So apart from the startup companies themselves, like I said earlier, the other companies that their activities create a supporting environment for the improvement or advancement of these startups. There are also a lot of incentives for them, and therein again lies the opportunity. Aaron. So Kazim mentioned the National Council of Digital Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which was set up by the Act, right? And this council, like he said, it's going to be composed of both private sector participants and government officials, right? And all policies and the general direction of the digital ecosystem in Nigeria is supposed to go through this council. And because of its constitution, the policies and all that are supposed to be robust, because they're supposed to have taken into consideration both the private sector, the private concerns, whatever concerns that they may have, and their comments, and as well as government concerns and government needs. And also, we believe that this council, once it is fully set up and functional, would indeed help to drive, and it is indeed supposed to help to drive the implementation of this act. Kasim also mentioned the National Information Technology Development Agency, which is where the Secretariat really lies, right? And they are the ones that are supposed to implement, so they are the ones that are supposed to ensure that the provisions of the Act are actually implemented to the letter, are the ones that are supposed to ensure that, everything that the policies that are going to be passed by the council and all that they're implemented. And then we also have the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, which was not set up by the Act, and meanwhile the NIFTA was also not set up by the Act, but it's a current, is an existing authority, but a mention of it is very relevant because they are supposed to also manage the Startup Investment Seed Fund, which we'll see further, which we'll see, we'll see what the fund is and what the fund is about, and how startups or other people within the tech ecosystem can access this fund and, for financing their operations. Aaron. So let's get right into the startups eligibility for labeling status. Please, if you have any questions, please remember to note them down. I'm sure Dan and his team would take up, and we have a question and answer session after this presentation, right? So basically, before you can take advantage of the incentives that we're going to be looking at in this act for startup companies, right? You have to have been labeled. You have to go through the process of being what you call in the act a labeled startup. So it's not enough for you to say, I'm a startup, I meet the criteria. You have to actually apply and get a labeled status. If you don't do that, then you won't be able to take advantage of any of the incentives here for startups, right? And one of the criteria is you must be registered under the laws of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. So you must be a company registered here. You may ask, what if I'm a partnership? What if I'm a sole proprietorship? Or what if I'm just carrying on business, by myself with my name? Well, the Act actually allows sole proprietorships and partnerships to register, to go through this whole processing for to register for a labeling status, right? But when you get that status, you have like 6 months to convert to a company. A company is a limited liability company, or a limited by guarantee company, or an unlimited company under the Act. But you must convert. You can't continue with the state of label status if you are not a registered company. So the first step is that you must be a company, and you must be registered under the laws of Federal Republic of Nigeria. So if you are registered outside the country, if you're a foreign company, well, you can't, as a foreign company, apply for the startup label status. You will not get it, right? And then the second point is that you must not have been in existence for more than 10 years. So that means that even if you're in your 9th year, maybe you were incorporated in 2012, I think, there's still an opportunity for you once the portal is up and running. There's still an opportunity for you to apply for and get the labeling status. But you must not have been in existence for over 10 years. If you've been in existence for over 10 years, you will not be granted the label status. Then this third criteria is key, because it's key because it's one of the things that drove the enactment of this act, right? To encourage local talent, to bring up local guys. So you must have at least 1/3 of your shareholding must be held by one or more Nigerians as founders or as co-founders. So if you have a company that is held wholly that's held maybe 100% by a foreign company, you will not get the label status, right? You must have at least, so when setting up your entity, you as a Nigerian founder or a Nigerian co-founder, as the case may be, if you're not the founder, you need to have at least 1/3 of the local shareholding in your name, right? And then of course, the objective should be the creation, innovation, production, development, or adoption of a unique digital technology, innovative product, service, or process. So this is not just about being a startup. Sometimes startup can be used, that word or that phrase can be used loosely to mean, any new company that has just come into business, right? For the purposes of this act, it's specific to people within the tech ecosystem. So you must have in your object, your memorandum of and articles of association must show indeed that this is what you have been set up for. So it must include this. Also, you must also be the holder of a product or process of digital technology, or you are the owner or author of a registered software. So you must be able to show that, look, I have a product or a process of digital technology, or I have a registered software. Now, it's not clear yet if you are still in development stage or you are still at idea stage, if you can submit and say, okay, look, I don't yet have a product, or I don't yet have a service, but this is where I'm going to, or I'm currently in the process of creating it. It's not clear yet whether or not you will pass if you do not, strictly speaking, meet this criteria. So whether you're still in development stage and you're still iffy, you can see it is assumed, because the act also makes a lot of provision, also allows for a lot of research and development by companies, by these startup companies, and training and all that. But we are not yet clear yet how that will be treated, whether indeed you must already have the registered software, or you must already have the product or process. That is, it should not be in development, but we'll see how that pans out, of course, once the portal kicks in. And then another key point is that you must not be a holding company or subsidiary of an existing company which is not registered as a startup. Now, this is also very important, because we know that a lot of startups would like to register their companies maybe in other jurisdictions for whatever reason, that's outside the Nigerian jurisdiction, maybe because of access to funding, or maybe maybe the regulatory environment is friendlier, or things like that. And then we now want to bring in these companies to now hold the shares of the local entity here as the operating entity. What this rule, or what this particular criteria is saying, is that you cannot be a holding company. That means you cannot be holding the shares of another company that is not registered as a startup company, right? And then you cannot also be a subsidiary of a company that is not registered as a startup, that is not labeled as a startup in Nigeria. So in setting up, we would encourage tech companies, the ones that want to go for the startup label, to be aware of this criteria, so that when they're setting up, with a view to ensuring that they meet all the relevant criteria for labeling. Now, once you meet this criteria, the next thing to do is to submit an application with your relevant document to the Secretariat. Now, the supported document, I am thinking it would be things that prove that you meet all these criteria. We don't yet have a list, but it should be things that basically, because the criteria has already been set, it should not be things that basically show that, yes, I'm able to check all these boxes that I am required to check. And of course, once you have met the criteria, then it's now for the coordinator that's NIDA to approve. So the submission is going to be done on the portal, which we'll discuss, what the startup portal is about. But startup portal is hosted by NIDA, which, as Kazim mentioned, is the secretariat, where the secretariat is domiciled for this act, right? And once you meet the criteria, you're now supposed to submit you're supposed to get the certificate. So you're supposed to be issued a digital certificate and be labeled as a startup. Now, like I said earlier on, you really need to be labeled as a startup in order to be able to access the incentives in this act. If you're a startup, if you're a startup, technically that is, you meet all the criteria, but you are not labeled by the secretariat, which is the NIDA in this case, you will not be able to access any of the incentives, which we are going to talk about later on in this act. And normally, the startup label is valid for a period of 10 years from the date of issuance. At least that's what the act says. So perhaps, again, we'll see how this is treated in practice, whether or not, if you are a 9th year company, remember that one of the criteria is that you must not be in existence for more than 10 years. But you could have been in existence for 9 years. If you're a 9th year company, does that mean you have an additional 10 years? Or are you limited to just that 1 year so that you don't cut over to 10 years? We'll see how all that pans out. But what the letter of the act says to be is that you get your certificate, and it's a certificate for 10 years. Obviously, it's a labeling for 10 years. There are also provisions which also allow the NIDA to delabel you, as to remove your labeling status if you don't meet, you don't continue to meet the relevant, you don't keep to the guidelines, you don't continue to meet whatever it is that is set out in the guidelines for ensuring that you're able to maintain that status. So, like I said, the first step is getting the eligibility, getting the labeling status. Aaron. And then once that is done, once you are labeled a startup. Now, so like I said earlier in the presentation, the act is not only for startups. The act is also for people within the tech community, the tech ecosystem generally, right? But we are starting today with discussing startups, right? And what it means for these startups, these tech startups. So once you get your labeling status, once you have gone through that process, you've met all the criteria, and you are given a labeling status, then all of a sudden, you have now been, you are now open to be able to access all the incentives under the act. And therein lies the opportunity, where because of all these incentives, you have fiscal incentives, which talks about tax rebates, benefits, tax credits, you have funding and financial support, access to information, training, regulatory support, and all of a sudden you are visible. You are more visible than you would have been without it. I know that in my practice, some people have asked me over time, maybe some new tech companies, how do we get access to funding? I have this idea, I have this solution. I'm looking for a VC, that's a venture capital fund to invest in me, or I'm looking for an angel investor. How do we get seen? How do we get our ideas out there? This is one of the ways, right? Because all of a sudden, and we will see that when we get to visibility, all of a sudden you are out there, you are visible to these guys, and you are able to take advantage of whatever assistance or whatever support they're able to offer to your business. So we'll start with the fiscal incentives, right? So under the fiscal incentives, we have 6 main incentives. At least we have categorized it into 6 really. And what is key to note is that even apart from these incentives that have been put down in the act, the council can from time to time extend the incentive. So it's like, okay, we're looking at what we've currently provided for, we're looking at what is being accessed, how can we get more people to enjoy or more people to participate, or how can we get more people in this industry? Perhaps it is to extend the incentives that we're currently offering and things like that. So apart from what you already have there, there's also an opportunity for the council to bring out more incentives, or working with the federal government and the relevant Ministry of Finance, I believe, to issue out directives or policies which will positively impact startups. So the first one is the Pioneer Status Incentive Scheme. Now, as some of you would know, Pioneer Status, currently it exists. So it exists today, even without the act, right? Without the Start-up Act. And it basically is, if you are in an industry that is designated as a Pioneer Status industry, right? You apply and go through the process, and you are granted Pioneer Status. It means that all of a sudden you have relief from income tax. You can get it for up to a period of 5 years. It's typically for a period of 3 years and renewable for 2 additional years. But this means that all of a sudden you don't have to pay companies income tax for the 5 years, for the first 5 years of your existence. In this case, for labeled startups, you don't have to pay companies income tax for the first 5 years of you getting a labeled status. So once you get your startup label, from that day for the next 5 years, companies income tax will not apply to you. But remember that this is not automatic. So this you still have to apply for, and you still have to meet the relevant conditions that already exist in the Act. So that's in the Industrial Development Income Tax Relief Act, which is the act that sets up the Pioneer Status Scheme, right? You have to meet the relevant conditions there. And more importantly, you have to be operating in the pioneer industry. Now, the pioneer industries change from time to time, right? But right now on the list, we do have software development. So if you're in the ICT industry and you're doing software development and publishing, things like that, you are going to be granted, you can apply for this pioneer status, to be granted a pioneer status. Also, if you are doing business processes, maybe whatever it is you're doing, your product or your service or your process is supposed to improve business processes, you can also apply for this. Also, if you're like sharing, if you are like doing shared offices and things like that, you can also apply for this. What this act does, like I said, this pioneer status incentive, it's not today. We've had it for a bit, it's been around. But what the Startup Act does is that it fast tracks the process for you. So instead of going through the normal process of having to apply for the pioneer status and going through the long, spending a long time on it and going through, having to submit millions of documents and applications and having to make representations, all of a sudden that whole process, that whole application process is reduced for you. It's reduced. You make your application through the state startup portal, and your application is also given priority. So apart from the relief from tax holiday and something, you also have deduction of fixed assets costs after your tax or holiday. So normally when you acquire fixed assets during your tax holidays, because you have pioneer status, you are entitled to deduct these fixed assets after the pioneer status period. Remember that you're not paying taxes during the pioneer status period already, right? So you now have, for example, you spend money on fixed assets after the 5-year cutoff. If you are given up to 5 years for your pioneer period, then after that cutoff, you can now deduct whatever assets you bought during your pioneer status from your you can deduct it, and it would, if you do tax or if you know tax, you understand that once you have something that is deductible, it automatically reduces the taxes that you would have to pay, right? So that is also an advantage that the Act that the pioneer status relief brings. And of course, tax losses incurred during the tax holiday can also be set off against taxable profits which you enjoy, which you earn after the holiday. So if during the holiday, some of you may say, oh, well, during the first 5 years, it doesn't really count because I'm actually making losses, right? I'm not making any profit, so it doesn't benefit me. But it does, because those your losses, you can actually set them off against profits after the holiday, even though you made those losses during the period, right? And then, excuse me, dividends paid out of pioneer profits are tax exempt. So whether or not you pay them during the pioneer period or after the pioneer period, so long as they are paid out of pioneer profits, they are tax exempt. So those are the incentives you get when you apply and you qualify for pioneer status, right? Then the next one under fiscal incentives will be deductibility of R&D expenses. R&D there will be research and development expenses, right? So under the Act, you are allowed 100% full deduction of any expenses you incur on research and development. That is the expenses incurred wholly in Nigeria, by the way, on research and development. You are able to deduct these from your taxable, from what would ordinarily have been your tax, to reduce your taxable profit. So you're able to deduct it. It's an allowable expense. This is different from what's typically obtained, because what typically obtains is that you are typically allowed a deduction up to 10%. So imagine not only being able to deduct only 10%, all of a sudden you're able to deduct all, that's 100% of all expenses spent during incurred on research and development, right? This, of course, is to encourage startups to do a lot of research, spend a lot of resources on research and development, because we know that in the tech ecosystem, things change by the minute, right? You need to keep researching, you need to keep developing new products, new processes, and all that. And all these expenses are deductible. So that's one of the incentives that the Act gives. Also, for withholding tax, industrial training fund, right? So the Act also allows you to, so under the Industrial Training Fund Act, right, companies in Nigeria today are expected to pay 1% of their payroll a year to the fund. Now, the fund is supposed to help to develop training, capacity, and all that, and to train people as workers in Nigeria. So companies typically will pay 1% of their staff payroll to ITF. But under the Act, if you do in-house trainings, right, if you train your employees and employees by yourself and you can show evidence of this, you will be exempt from paying or from contributing to this fund. Again, I must point out that this is already an incentive that does exist, because typically, if you do train your employees and you can show it, you are supposed to be exempt from the ITF. But what typically would happen is that you are not able to claim it, maybe you're not able to prove it, or maybe the hassle of going through all that is a bit too much, and so you just end up paying the 1%. But here, remember that, and again, we'll get to it, the startup portal simplifies these things so that it's easy for you to put in evidence that, look, I'm training my staff, so I'm not supposed to pay this 1% of my payroll cost to ITF, right? Then we have the withholding tax relief. This relief allows you to pay non-resident companies that provide technical, consulting, professional, or management services to label startups. All of a sudden, they're subject to tax at 5%, withholding tax at 5% rather than 10%. You may say, well, this doesn't really concern me because I'm not the one paying your tax. It's not my tax, it's for the professional entities. But it does concern you because, most times people will gross up their fee, or even if they don't gross up their fee, they will take into consideration the fact that you are going to be withholding certain monies from their fee in quoting whatever it is that they are going to quote for the service, right? So because we now have a less amount in subject, a less less value for withholding tax, all of a sudden you will see that you are able to pay for these services at a lower cost. And of course, for the non-resident companies that are providing these services, this is like a final tax for them. Then we have the export incentives. So as a labeled startup, if you are entitled to export incentives and financial assistance from the Export Development Fund and all those other export grants, you are able to apply, and it's supposed to be easy for you to access these incentives and all that. And like I said earlier, the federal government, apart from even bringing out policies and being able to expand on these fiscal incentives at any time, they are also able to simplify the requirements for a startup. So apart from what we've already said, all these requirements to ordinarily benefit from some of these things that maybe were already in existence, federal government is also saying that, look, we may even simplify these processes for you as a tech startup so that you don't have to go through all this hassle. It's a simpler process and all that, again, just to encourage the growth of this industry in Nigeria. Aaron. So apart from the fiscal incentives, we also have funding, financial support. Startup Investment Seed Fund. Now, this is a very, very important fund. It was set up by the Act, and the fund is supposed to be applied to provide labeled startups with finance, provide them with early stage finance, and then to help them to grow their businesses. Now, this fund currently is supposed to be have at least 10 billion is supposed to be contributed to the fund every year. 10 billion naira every year, and it's supposed to be accessed by startups, labeled startups. Where the contribution will come from, we are not yet sure, but it's stated there that the fund is supposed to have seeded with 10 billion every year, and is managed by the Sovereign Investment Authority, which we mentioned earlier. So if you're a labeled startup, all of a sudden you have access to this fund. You are able to apply, able to submit your application, and whatever else that the fund managers would require you to submit, right? In order to be able to access the fund, you're able to do that, and you're able to get access, and all of a sudden you're able to get more financing. You have availability or access to more financing than you ordinarily would have had without the Act. Access to grants and loan facilities. So apart from the fund, which we are not yet clear whether the fund will be investing in loans or equities, but we just know that the fund will invest, right? Apart from this fund, you also have access to grants and loan facilities. So where you have CBN programs or Bank of Industry programs or any other program that any other statutory body that will typically assist small and medium scale enterprise and entrepreneurs, you have access to it. Now you may say, oh, ordinarily, well, if I were a business in Nigeria, I would ordinarily have access to this fund. Perhaps, but guess what? It is difficult typically to access these funds. But what the Start-up Act does is that it makes things easier. So you have like a dedicated line. You're able to quickly and very seamlessly have access to this fund. Of course, once you meet the relevant criteria by whatever financier, whatever body that is providing the financing. And then crowdfunding, you are allowed to raise funds through licensed crowdfunding intermediaries. So right now, the SEC has a process for licensing crowdfunding intermediaries. And once you have a crowdfunding intermediary, a platform that is registered by the SEC for crowdfunding, you can go there and raise funds that you require for your business. Also, you're also able to raise, apart from the crowdfunding intermediaries, from commodities investments platforms as well that have been that are made available on the startup program. So on the startup portal. So apart from you as a startup accessing or being able to do that, even the crowdfunding intermediary has an opportunity all of a sudden they're able to go register on the startup portal as a service provider and get startups to come and raise money through their platforms. Of course, that there is an opportunity. Then credit guarantee schemes, you are also, as a startup, as a labeled startup, you would also be provided financial support, credit guarantees, in terms of credit guarantees, information, financial management, credit building programs, and all that. All that will be accessible to labeled startups. Again, of course, there will be criteria to be met and all that, but like I said, it is a seamless, or it is supposed to be a seamless process. It's supposed to be easy, right? Once you're using the portal and once you're a labeled startup. Aaron. And then we have other incentives. So the fiscal incentives and the funding and financial support, perhaps we say, are the big ones. But apart from those ones, we have other incentives that are also important and also create opportunities for these tech startups in Nigeria. You have access to information and training, and then of course you also have regulatory support and visibility. So we'll take the access to information training first. Access to information. So, I've talked about the startup portal a lot during this presentation. What is key to note is that you have this portal, which is going to be, I believe is going to domicile it somewhere, maybe on their site. And on this portal, you have a lot of information. So you as a label startup, you will be up there, first of all, because that's even how you even apply for the process. You will see other players in the ecosystem. You will see accelerators, you will see incubators, you will see some investors. I talked about crowdfunding intermediaries who will go and register there. You all of a sudden have a lot of information. You can access a lot of information, what is going on in the ecosystem, who is doing what am I, okay, I need funding, where can I get funding? Oh, I'm not really sure, can I register my trademark? Can I not register it? Or can I register my IP, my intellectual property? Should I not register it? You would have access to all this information on the portal. So the portal will foster information exchange and will be used also to disseminate information. So apart from being a hub for information, you will also get information from the secretariat, from NICTA, from the portal. Then of course there are training opportunities. The act, I talked about industrial training fund earlier, and I said what it's about. But apart from that fund, the secretariat is supposed to design and implement training and capacity building programs for startups. So they are working with the ITF, that's the Industrial Training Fund. They're working with other training entities. They're supposed to keep, help in training people and in capacity building, right? They're also supposed to establish accelerator and incubator programs to provide startups with mentorship, education, educational assistance, and to aid their growth. So apart from even providing these programs, they're also supposed to help with policies for existing accelerators and incubators. Again, the accelerators and incubators would have more visibility. And because they have more visibility, they are also able to, startups are also able to see, oh, okay, I'm interested in this accelerator program, I'm interested in this incubator program. Also, the portal does create visibility for the startups. And then you now have regulatory support. So if you notice that throughout the course of this presentation, a lot of things that we've talked about as like ease. All of a sudden you have the Corporate Affairs Commission having a section on the portal where you don't have to go through the normal stress of going to the CSC portal or going to the CSC to file things. You're able to deal with it on the startup portal. It's like a one-stop shop. Same thing as CBN. CBN will have its own section on the portal. NOTAP, which is the National Office for Technology Acquisition, they typically, if you want to license or register your agreements where there's technology transfer involved and all that, you are supposed to go to NOTAP and do that registration. But instead of going to different regulatory agencies, you just have this one portal where you go and you're able to meet all your needs. So again, with the trademarks, patents, and designs registry, you're able to do that. So all these people would have separate sections on the portal where you are able to, where as a labeled startup, you'll be able to access. And then if you are labeled startup, if you want to go into the regulatory sandbox, now a regulatory sandbox is what the CBN and the SEC, it's like if you have a product where you are not sure that product requires regulatory oversight, you're not sure you require a SEC license, or you're not sure you require a CBN license, maybe because it's so innovative, it's never been done before, so there's actually no rule currently that governs it. But you think that it's possible, I'm not sure I can do this thing without this kind of license. Like if you're a fintech, you may think, oh, I'm not sure I can do this thing without the CBN license, or I'm not sure I can do this thing without the SEC license. You will typically go, both agencies have like a process whereby you do like a kind of discovery. So you make an application to the stand, you like apply to be put into a regulatory sandbox where they examine your processes, they examine your product, your service, whatever it is that you are providing, and they will tell you whether or not you are required to come for registration. So with this act, the regulatory sandbox, you also have it here. So the process of applying will be seamless. You're able to do it from the startup portal. So it makes things easier. If you're doing business, I mean, one of the key issues or one of the key factors that contributed to the death of a lot of startups in Nigeria is the difficulty of doing business in Nigeria, right, prior to now, and apart from government policies and all that. So this act is trying to correct all that by making it a bit easier for startups to be able to, get whatever it support that they need in order to be able to do their business in a lawful manner. So those are the incentives for the startups that you have under the act. Of course, there are for other incentives for other players within the ecosystem. Aaron, you have the accelerators and incubators. Aaron, please, next slide, please. You have the accelerators and incubators. So apart from, we've talked a lot about startups, but remember that we said at the beginning that the act is not only applicable to startups or people that are registered, labeled as startups, but also companies that provide support to the system. So it's companies that provide support, encourage the growth of these companies. They're also able to take advantage of certain incentives under the act. So apart from the startups, we also have people that we call accelerators, right? We have a definition there. It's a fixed-term cohort-based program which provides a startup with mentorship and educational assistance to aid its growth. We actually do have a few of them here. And then we have incubators, an organization whose principal object is to support the establishment and development of a startup, promotion of innovation and related activities through the offer of dedicated physical spaces and services. So we have these guys too playing within the tech ecosystem. And we're saying that, look, apart from these startups, you are also entitled to some incentives. Now, the incentives haven't really been spelled out in the act, but the federal government is saying, we will grant you relevant incentives, right? We'll grant you incentives. Well, we haven't yet said it, what exactly these incentives are, but there will be incentives. There will be incentives. You'll be entitled to grants that will aid your research, your development, your training, and your expansion projects. You'll also be entitled to grants given under the Nigerian Digital Innovation Entrepreneurship and Startup Policy and any other policy that may be issued. And then, of course, you will probably be entitled to some incentives, which they would roll out in due course, right? So these are also opportunities for these guys to take advantage of these incentives to be able to grow their businesses, even as they are aiding the promotion and the growth of startups in Nigeria. And we also have incentives for investors. Investors are not left out. People that put in money, they invest, right? And this is whether or not you are a foreign investor or you are a local investor. The first is, look, first of all, you are able to repatriate your capital, you are able to repatriate your dividend. That simply means that you're able to take it back. So if you came from a foreign country, you're able to take it back to your country. So you're a company maybe based out of the US and you invest in a Nigerian startup. The government is saying that, look, we guarantee that you'll be able to take your money back and you'll be able to take your returns on investment back. And not only you'll be able to take it back, but we also understand that once you get it, once you bring in your money through the legal means and you get a certificate of capital importation, which is a CCI, you are able to access funding, USD or whatever currency, Forex, at the central bank rate, official rate, in order to take back your money. Now, again, this is an incentive that already exists for foreign investors in Nigeria today. So it's nothing new, but we like to believe that what the startup portal is going to do or is going to simplify this process for these investors and perhaps also give them priority. Again, in line with the federal government goal to grow and develop this industry very quickly. So you need investors coming in, both local investors and foreign investors, and this would definitely encourage investors if they're able to take their money back out when the time is right. Again, you also get tax credits on investments, so people that investors that invest will get tax credits on their investments, and then capital gains tax there'll be no charge. So when there's a disposal of assets that have been held in Nigeria for a minimum of 2 years, there will be no capital gains tax on that disposal. We know that very recently, one of the Finance Acts, I believe was 2020 or 2021, introduced the payment of capital gains tax on disposal of shares. That wasn't what was the law before. But with that introduction, even with that introduction, for people that invest in startups, or investors that invest in startups and hold that investment for up to 24 months, they will still be exempted from paying capital gains tax on any gain that they make upon the disposal of assets. Those are the incentives that we have in the Act, right? You can see that from these incentives that opportunities do exist, both for startups, for accelerators, incubators, investors, people within the system, even service providers, right? And these opportunities, if indeed this Act is, if it is implemented the way it is supposed to be implemented, indeed, you will see that there will be opportunity for growth in the tech ecosystem in Nigeria. We didn't mention, there's allowance, or there's a provision for hubs and things like that, clusters, development of clusters and hubs for innovation, kind of like you have Silicon Valley, and all those technology hubs out of the UK. The opportunity, in fact, the Act actually says that each state of the federation would have to create, there will be a hub, a technology hub created in each state of the federation. I mean, we don't know how that will go, particularly in the states that are not very forward thinking, but the intention is that there will indeed be these hubs, and these hubs will help to grow the industry. It will help to foster the growth of tech in Nigeria generally. It will encourage people to domicile their tech business here. It will encourage people to invest directly here rather than going through an offshore entity to invest, and then that offshore entity will be investing here. No, the growth will happen here. This is where the operational and the holding company, all the startup labels will be. So these opportunities are what this Act presents. We do note, however, that since we passed this Act, I guess you can say that it takes time, but we haven't really seen a lot of activity from the federal government level. I've been to the leaders' websites a couple of times. We haven't really seen much there, but we believe that things are going on behind the scenes because there's a lot to do. We believe that things are going on behind the scenes. But even apart from the federal government at that level, we know that in December last year, Lagos State, did a policy review workshop, right, on how to implement the Act for the state's growth. And one of the things that came out from that workshop was the establishment, the birthing of the Knowledge, Innovation, Technology, and Entrepreneurship Project. It's called the KITE project, which is supposed to, amongst other things, to localize that act in Lagos State, and create like an initiative, statewide initiative that would create ICT clusters across the state. I mean, starting from Yaba, where we know that there's a lot of cluster. There's a cluster there, it's an ICT cluster there, and all that. So that's what Lagos State is doing right now. We'd like to think that the federal government and other states have also started. But even as they are getting ready to do this, we also, as players in the industry, we should be positioning ourselves to take advantage of the incentives, of the opportunities that this act presents. Thank you very much.
Kelechi, thank you very much, and Kazim for that incredibly informative webinar. You covered so much detail. I'm sure our audience has appreciated your time and effort. And we have had a lot of questions in from the audience. And looking at the time, I think that we have time to just cover one of those questions. And I think that this is quite a detailed point. It's regarding point number 3 on the criteria page, which we've just pulled up now on 1/3 local shareholding. So we just want to know, does this mean, for instance, if there are 3 shareholders, 2 foreign companies and a local founder, is it adequate if the local founder has 1% of shares, since 1/3 of the shareholders are local, or does the local founder need at least 33.3%?
Thank you, Dan. I think the intent of that act is 1/3 of shareholding and not necessarily shareholders. So you have the local founder has to have at least 33% of the shareholding of that startup entity to be able to qualify for a labeling status. I hope that clarified.
Thank you very much, Kelechi. And to Mariam, who asked that question, I do encourage you to please do get in touch with Kelechi and Kazim on that, and you can discuss in a bit more detail. So I want to finish there, just looking at the time, but thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. We really appreciate you being with us. And of course, once again, thank you to Kelechi and Kazim for such a fascinating webinar. If you do have any further questions that you want to ask, please do get in touch. We'll be sending a follow-up with their contact details and a copy of the recording of today's webinar to you in due course. So thank you very much for being with us. I wish you a good day. Goodbye.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Kazim. Thank you, everyone, for being here.